Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Allister Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep.
Here we are with Lara from marketing with some new questions for us.
Yes, everyone was quite keen. We've had quite a few questions pop through, so it's really cool to see. First up, we have one from David Squibb.
Squibby's a previous colleague from us in Tasmania, so really excited to see the question, David.
Can you please explain the nitrogen production cycle using legumes in a pasture system, and how do the nodules release N?
Yes, so this is this natural relationship with legumes where they have a symbiotic relationship with a small fungus that creates nodules that absorb atmospheric nitrogen and provide the plant via these nodules with a source of nitrogen.
Because I think we forget that the air we breathe is about 70% nitrogen. So there's a lot up there. And I guess the clover plant is just taking some of that and putting it into the ground.
Correct. But there's two ways that the nitrogen fixed in these nodules cycle, and you probably got a stronger lead on the first way.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's the most important, but it's the coolest, I think, of the two. And that is where you've got essentially plant proteins in the clover plant that are being consumed by animals, and a proportion of those will then be returned to the soil through urine. And that is a really important way that we cycle nitrogen. So animals coming through the pasture, consuming that material, the nitrogen in that, some of it's used for productive purposes in the animal, but a proportion of that is also cleared in urine, is returned to the pasture and becomes soil nitrogen.
I'm suspicious that part of your question is associated with arable rotations and nodulation of legumes and arable rotations, where the primary mechanism for building soil available nitrogen for future cropping rotations is in the nodulation of the legume, the absorption of atmospheric nitrogen, and then the breaking down of root material, including the nodules, which get released on a warming soils. So what you're tending to find is you can pump legumes you grow legumes and they get nodulated, they build up with nitrogen, and then as you go through the heat of summer or the cold of winter, those nodules break off and the roots and root hairs die, and you tend to find they all get mineralized when soil temperatures are in the happy place for all the microbial activity to occur, which is pretty much the early to mid-spring and early to mid-autumn when all that gets released.
So actually the root death and nodule breakdown is actually a naturally occurring process.
Technically, you would describe a spring flush and an autumn flush, and most of that is being driven by microbial activity of breaking down roots and root material that has died through winter and died through summer, and they then get broken down in the following sort of 2 to 3 months when all that biological life really lights up. So, Squibby, I hope that helps. I do think it's really important to understand, though, that they typically are in early to mid-spring and early to mid-autumn when all that nitrogen gets released, apart from in your arable systems when you actually work in those root structures after you've harvested legume-based crops, and you tend to find that builds up your soil nitrogen environment well, but you still tend to find the primary breakdown phase is in that sort of like mid to early to mid-autumn and early to mid-spring.
So summary, nitrogen out of the atmosphere into the plant, goes into the soil in two ways: directly through root death or nodular breakdown, or indirectly through the animal out through urine into the soil.
Yeah, cycling.
Awesome. Great explanation. Thanks, guys. Another cue from Mark. He likes to send through a few. How many litres of urine was tested in the development of Ecotane?
That's a question for you, Glenn.
That's a great question.
And I'd add another one onto that. And what types of urine?
Yeah, well, I was going to say it would be easily into the thousands of litres of urine that we have collected, measured.
Man, Glenn, you really take the piss.
And to the point that a lot of that's been done in with dairy and beef cattle, and they're producing quite a large amount per day, so quite easily to fill up a 20-litre container quite quickly from dairy cattle. We have also done this in sheep, so a lot of work in sheep, not so much volume there. Deer. So again, not a huge amount of volume, but we've been working in deer and dogs. We've done a little bit of work in dogs, and that's not really on around urine volume, but certainly nitrogen concentration. They have very concentrated urine, dogs. If you haven't A, observed, or B, smelt dog urine.
I do think it's ironic how proud you were when you showed me the first photo of a bucket full of deer urine. I thought that was really weird. Anyway, moving on. Lara.
And one last one. If you were a forage, what would you be and why?
You first, Glenn.
Well, I've thought deeply about this, obviously, and I reckon I'm probably the closest to savvy cocksfoot. And the reason I say that is got good strong roots. From time to time, I do look a little bit scruffy, so similar there. I've got some really clumpy habits, so very similar to a cocksfoot. And I am at home in Canterbury, which is very much like a cocksfoot. So I think a savvy cocksfoot is probably what I'd be most aligned to.
If well managed, you're quite palatable too. But if you're left unmanaged, your palatability does go off a little bit, Juddy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I need to be managed.
Gosh, that's a hard one because, I do quite like my plants and my different cultivars of within the Agricom portfolio. I actually would just go for white clover. I think it's pretty plastic. I reckon I can be a bit plastic at times and change to my circumstances. It can be treated pretty rough there for periods of time, but if it's lax, it can actually turn into a completely different animal. I quite like that. Yeah, I think white clover. It seems it's a bit of a catch-all one, but I'd probably have the strongest affinity for white clover.
Do you reckon you'd be a small leaf white clover or a ladino?
I suspect one or two of the listeners that might be related to me might say I'd be a large leaf white clover, and I think those listeners would fully appreciate that. Anyway.
Awesome. Thank you to you both. If you have any questions, technical, serious, or anything and everything in between, please feel free to email info@agricom.co.nz or flick us a message on our Facebook page, Agricom NZ. Thanks.
Thanks, Lara. Well, welcome into the Al and Juddy Show. Hi, Allister.
Hey, Juddy.
What are we going to talk about today?
Well, Juddy, we're going to talk about another herb, actually. We've covered off a herb plantain in a previous podcast on ecotane, actually. And this time around, we're going to be talking about the pasture herb chicory. And it's actually another really important first for New Zealand, as in the late 80s or in the 80s, Ag Research at the time pretty much created the first forage chicory that we used, a variety called Puna. And from that, we started to see a huge amount of research being done on it, and a lot of that will be teased out today.
Cool. And hopefully we'll cover some farm systems that would use this in, some of the limiting factors that we might have with this particular plant, and why on most of the time we're getting really good animal performance off this particular herb. But let's start at the beginning because that's a pretty good place to start. Tell me a little bit about the plant. How would you recognise that you've got chicory in your pasture apart from the fact that someone's charged you for the seed?
Well, like I say, once upon a time, chicory was a very winter dormant plant, and actually through the time frame that it's quite winter dormant, you would actually mistake it for a dandelion. And so that's a little bit of the visual component of the variety Puna from the past, there'll be any number of plants within the Puna population of the past that in winter you would have actually mistaken for a dandelion. So if that can help a few listeners get their heads around what it is. What's happened since then is a number of varieties have been created, all of which have got a very defined leaf, and it's called a whole leaf. Basically, it's not segmented in any way, and because of that, it's quite distinctive. It's very herbaceous, and for majority of the year, this plant tries to grow a little bit more upright. A lot more of the modern genetics have a little bit of winter activity or cool season activity. So it is very herbaceous, very high in water content, a herb that has got a distinctly large taproot that probably could be related to what you would see in some of the weed species, such as dandelions. In Europe, chicory is actually still used as an arable crop, where it's also been described as willow in that region, and it's a vegetable crop in that state.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you look back on the use of chicory over time, one of the more famous uses of chicory is actually as a coffee substitute. It's a material that they use to substitute coffee, but it's got no caffeine in it. And I don't know why A, you'd want to substitute coffee, and B, not drink caffeine, but they did that. And it was actually the ground up root which had been roasted. And that was what they were making this coffee substitute out of. At this time, it would be an important thing to recognise that I wouldn't rush around breaking the root of chicory and just tasting it, because, oh my God, someone did that to me once. Might have been a Dr. Alan Stewart, plant breeder that I've had in my career my whole time, and he might have said, have a wee taste of this, Al, and for about 30, 40 minutes afterwards, trying to get the taste of that root, that raw chicory root out of my mouth was, it's awful. So quite bitter, quite bitter. So, the you've described the chicory plant, but like a dandelion, lovely blue flower.
Correct. Probably the more distinctive state in its reproductive form. It's got a very sky blue, very, very, very attractive little flower. Yep.
And on the end of quite a large reproductive growth.
Woody stem. It can be closing in on 6 foot high inside a seed production crop, but in pastoral zones it could get probably between waist and midriff high if left unmanaged.
And it's hollow too, isn't it?
Only once it gets to its lignified state, as it becomes woodier and woodier, the central part is hollow. And
we'll touch on why that's important when we come to a little bit of the uses of it and some of the limitations of it. In terms of it's got a taproot. Yep. The other thing I want to cover, because it's quite unusual about the way this plant seeds, is tell me about the pollination of chicory.
Yeah, it's actually quite a difficult plant to get high germination out of the seed, because if you could picture this tall stem that could be, like I say, in seed production terms, as high as 6 foot high, the seed, the flowers come out in what the best description I can give without not being an arable person and not knowing the exact detail, but they come out in whorls, so they don't all just flower all at once. So all the different branches within the seed head sort of have individual flowers popping out on certain days, and sort of like constant waves of flowering. Now, the key to chicory is that when a flower is created, a seed is created in each flowering point. However, only the flowers that are pollinated go through to create an embryo and then go through to become a viable seed. And so if you flower over, say, 2 to 3 to even 4 or 5 weeks, as the case this plant does, if you have a whole lot of bad weather, the predominant pollinator is bees, and bees have an extremely good union. So the moment the weather gets rough, bees stop working, and so you can go for whole days where there's not enough bee activity to pollinate all the flowers, but those flowers still set a seed, not a viable seed, but a seed. What this means, when it comes time for harvest time, all the flowers that have set seed during periods of rough weather where there's no pollinators acting, that seed enters the bulk, can't be dressed out because it's exactly like a pollinated and viable seed. And so what that does is impact your seed percentage. So it's a very difficult seed crop, particularly in summers that have variable weather. And because it's quite an intermediate and long flowering crop, there are any number of days that sometimes bees aren't as highly active. In New Zealand, we're lucky to have bumblebees, and they are really active all the time, but our populations aren't high enough to cover for the sheer numbers that the traditional honeybee can actually pollinate.
And so I guess this, do you call it blind seed? Is that be one way
I
of
don't think
describing
you
it?
would call that, because that's a disease.
Right.
This is just literally
Not being pollinated.
just not being pollinated and actually still forming a seed,
Yep.
just not a viable seed.
Yeah. All right. So tricky to produce seed off it.
Well, the other big point, though, that's just the germination. The other thing is, from a seed production technology, we are talking about trying to create pure seed of a plant that is herbaceous, and it's a dicotyledon plant that really relates significantly to a whole lot of thistles and a whole lot of weed species. So the sheer numbers of chemical options you have to create pure seed is quite limited. On saying that, our seed production technology team has certainly got it down to a fine art, and in some of our growing areas of the world, we have, compared to the past and the history, we have very, very clean seed lines now.
So when we're thinking about farm systems now, what are the farm systems that we would use chicory in? And I guess we've probably got two strands of thought here. We've got dairy systems and then other systems. Can you take us through how we'd use this first and foremostly in a dairy system?
Yeah, and I think this is really important to understand. And for a context, again, for a greater listenership, we have quite a diverse landscape in New Zealand, from quite a large area of natural rainfall dairy environments, but both in the south and in the north of New Zealand, and also irrigated landscapes. In the South Island of New Zealand, we're defined by being cool, not cold compared to the rest of the world, but cool in the winter, and we cool up quite slowly in the spring, and then have a decent summer period, which is not extreme but can be limiting at times, and then cool down quite fast in the South Island in the autumn, particularly from about the middle of the South Island to the south. In the north, though, we have a much milder winter environment. We warm up faster in the spring, and we tend to have a pretty almost on the edge of subtropical vibe around our dairy systems in the middle to the upper North Island. Now, it's in this zone that chicory has actually excelled in dairy, unirrigated dairy environments, because just with the changing phases of the climate at the moment and changes in climate at the moment, we are seeing more intense summers that are lasting for longer. So in the supplementary feed environment and dairy farms in the past, these farming systems have evolved in relatively secure landscapes. That the summers are relatively small, maybe anywhere between 4 and maybe 6 weeks maximum, and then back to a relatively highly productive state. But with climate variation, we have seen more intense summers in recent years, maybe the last 14 or so years, 15 sort of years. And what we're seeing is that 4 to 5 week window, which was really well serviced by summer turnips in the dairy sector for a supplementary protein source in the summer, where you're taking spring moisture, holding it in 10 to 12 tons of standing feed, and then strip grazing that through your dry window. What we're seeing is those dry windows are just getting longer and longer and longer, and turnips don't last the whole length of the dries that have been occurring. So what we've seen is the emergence of chicory as a summer crop in those dairy zones. And what's the strength of the chicory is that it's a multi-graze. It's not one hay shed. It's actually a grazing stand that the moment you get off it, it regrows extremely quickly. And the key to that is that if your drought lasts for longer than your 4 to 5 to 6 week window, and the drought goes on further and further and making life more and more stressful on a dairy farm, chicory tends to just get better and better. So it is as a species that's come into its own with a changing landscape. It's coming into its own because the dry phases on a productive unirrigated dairy farm are no longer as easily defined, and there is a lot more flexibility in a grazing regrowth herb for maintaining high quality protein, and some of the other nutritional traits we're going to talk about shortly.
And I guess so. It's living on its taproot, and it's accessing moisture further down the profile, and can grow quite nicely into those dry periods relative to what we've been using in the past.
And relative to an already established pasture that's limited by temperature and limited by heat and moisture profile.
And the really interesting thing about the use of chicory in that system is actually most of it doesn't go through a full 12 months.
No, not at all. And this is the point, is the value proposition is, what you're looking at with homegrown feed is that you're actually looking at what you can grow to substitute what you're missing most. And in the summertime, in a brown landscape, you're looking at green oases there, and anything that's green is likely to have high levels of crude protein. And between its easily grazed habit, its ability to stimulate grazing by literally being a herbaceous plant full of water in a hot, dry environment, you tend to find it as a perfect way of getting more dry matter, more energy into an animal under stress, but also a way of getting protein into a milking animal. So every other form of protein you buy in from off farm is 3 to 4 times the cost of what it is to sow and then harvest a certain volume of chicory. But that probably gets into how you make chicory work on a dairy platform and how it actually works, Glenn, because I think then we will go off this and talk about sheep and beef, and then we'll see the quite big difference in the style of system.
Yeah. So from an animal perspective, our recommendations are that animals, particularly lactating, aren't seeing more than about a third of their diet being chicory, and that's to do with the ability of this plant to actually create some milk taint.
Potentially.
So that's why we limit the proportion in the diet. But describe how you would typically use chicory in a dairy farm.
Well, also how you go about it. So you've hit upon the first part of the recipe, which is like we're looking at a plant that is looking to be about 20 to 25% of the animal's diet through the summer. So from that, you do some feed budgeting back to find out how much area you may need to commit to in a summer cropping program. So a general rule of thumb, depending on how warm and growthy your environment is that you are looking at between 4.5 to 5 hectares per 100 cows as the commitment to sowing. And once you do this, and that's based on allocating about 4 kilograms of the cow's diet through the summer months as chicory in a break. The feeding of that break is, we highly recommend that it's pre the afternoon milking. So in the heat of the day, when the animal is heat stressed, they're eating a herb that is full of water. It's actually elevating appetite at a time when actually appetite's quite suppressed in the heat of the day. So a couple of hours before afternoon milks, and it fits very, very nicely. However, it's getting it going for the economics of a relatively short-term cropping system that's important. So the take-home message with this plant is you can't afford to be late. You've got to be careful being too early, but you can't afford to be late. There's a couple of key drivers to this. So one of them is the change in soil temperature, and we're looking at a 12-degree soil temperature and rising. My recommendation in general terms is it's sitting somewhere in literally mid-spring as your target time for establishment. If you get your conditions right, the key is it's the speed to first grazing that is the most important thing about this. And the most important thing is if you get it late, you've got to remember you're putting a crop in as a dry land, a bank of feed in a dry land environment. So that means, by definition, between sowing and being able to graze it, you are going dry. If you sow late, the chances of the germination phase being right over an early dry phase is really high. So sowing time and sowing window is one of the most important things to create an economic outcome for the year, because after that, the economics is defined by how many grazings you can achieve, because there's a couple of criteria in our New Zealand dairy system that we find that we have to do, because chicory is perfect for the summer, but it's not perfect for longevity on a dairy platform. So just That's probably the critical point, establishing before the dry, but not too early when it's too cool, to get the speed of establishment you need to get it into your grazing system as early in the season as you possibly can.
Excellent. And I guess in a dairy system, there's not too many rules from a grazing perspective because it's in for such a short period of time.
Correct. So I suppose your primary rules are quite simple, and there's a nice bit of research on this, but you need the plant to be at about 7 true leaves. And because it's a big herbaceous plant and it looks like almost like a vegetable crop in its growing stage, it's not quite that hard to actually count those leaves, but you're aiming for about 7 true leaves. At this point, the animal won't be pulling out many of these plants, and so that's a really important point. You don't want all your future regrowth to be compromised by being pulled out of the ground.
So the 7 true leaves are at first grazing.
At first grazing. So that would typically coincide with a height of about 18 to 24 centimetres, which is about 2,000 to 2,500 kilograms of dry matter. Now, the grazing residuals, we are looking at about 4 to 5 centimetres, 5 centimetres. But as you've already pointed out, the rules around grazing residuals aren't hard and fast because it's not in the ground for a long time. You can get away with quite a bit. But the big point is you want to be able to come off it and let it regrow the very next day. In good growthy environments, you're aiming for about a 21-day rotation, and you're probably targeting about 2,800 kilograms standing, about 25 centimetres in the regrowth phase.
And it's something that you would apply some nitrogen to through the growing season?
Correct. About 30 to 40 units of nitrogen every second grazing. So the art of getting an economic return from chicory, as I've already stated, get it in on time. There is actually nothing more valuable to you. You're off to taking poor producing pastures, not your best paddocks, your most average paddocks out. And there is nothing that those paddocks are going to produce you of meaning during the summer dry. So make a decision, get your timeliness right on the mark, and that gets you in the chance to have the most regrowth cycles through the year, because the economics of growing chicory is to get as many regrowth cycles as possible. And that's all set up by the day you put it in the ground.
Yeah, so if you're late, you're just pruning off the days that you've got to use it.
And exposing yourself to trying to get established in droughted conditions. And that's, where you see literally only the wheel marks within a paddock germinate because of the soil consolidation.
So dairy system, anything else that we need to be aware of in a dairy system?
Well, I think that's probably where we get to this conflict between sheep and beef expectations and dairy expectations. We must just remember a lot of unirrigated dairy environments in the country may be summer dry, and therefore this really drought tolerant and productive summer cropping system is ideal. But they're also well over 1,000 to 1,200 millimetres of annual rainfall, which means that when they start raining, the landscape actually then gets wet. And we are discussing carrying quite a large amount of weight with these cattle on these pastures. So then we come back to the morphology of chicory, which is basically quite a large taproot. And that taproot isn't a hard and coarse root structure. It's actually quite soft, which basically means as the season progresses, the soils wet up and you get more grazing events over the top of wet soils. Perenniality can collapse quite dramatically in the following spring if you try to transfer that chicory in a dairy platform into a second year. And so in the heavier landscapes of particularly the North Island of New Zealand, in the summer cropping dairy world, about 85% of all chicory would be sprayed out or suppressed by spray in the autumn and then stitched in with permanent pasture. So you have 3, 4 or 5 grazings, and then if the temperature regime is still ideal, you suppress the chicory to the point of actually killing some of it, and then you get your new perennial pastures in, because grass still is king on the platform for the majority of the year. The key really is if you don't suppress that chicory, it is actually still in its prime growth phase and will act against your undersowing program almost like an intense weed contamination. So you must suppress it to get a good outcome from your sowing of your new grasses.
Cool. So that's probably dairy in a nutshell. A very useful plant when it comes to supplementing those dairy cows in what seemed to be an increasing length of time where we're running into moisture.
Flexible feed with chicory is what I would really describe it. You know, you if you really need it, you just keep it. And that's the big point. So as those dry periods go longer and longer into the autumn, chicory just gets actually stronger and stronger, which is, you know, a terribly stressful time on farm when you've got a lot of big animals needing to feed them. So
let's contrast that with the way we'd use that in a sheep, beef, or deer system, for example.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So for starters, there's actually two distinct worlds we'd use it in. Mostly some of these will be limited by your knowledge of your weed burdens within your landscape. But really, chicory has been the domain of mixed perennial pastures, so creating diversity in mixed pastures. And, you know, there's no doubt about it. When you're talking about functional diversity on farm, white clover, red clover, plantain, chicory, these are very, very traditional options in the New Zealand farming system in the temperate pastoral world. So we've been using these for 30 plus years, the way in this form. There are very, very few other functional diverse species that you can add to pasture in real terms, and chicory is the heart and soul of one of those herbaceous options. So typically 1 or 2 kgs in a pasture mix, Juddy, would be standard go-to, but remembering weed control and thistle control particularly is one of the limitations to long-term.
And I think where we do mix it with these other things, the things that allow this to be have some longevity in that pasture. Again, you've mentioned wet feet. Heavy soils, that tends to be a bit more problematic for this particular plant. Whether we've got free draining country, that's we can hold chicory a little longer in those. I guess the other thing, we'll talk a little bit about grazing management, but where we've got slightly longer rounds, that will favour chicory relative to short grazing intervals, if you like. So if in a mixed pasture, and we'd be using that in our normal pasture mixes, it adds diversity, as you say, it adds some sort of resilience to some of the environmental challenges to that. But that's one way we'd use that.
And I think you just got to keep remembering the sheep and beef industry is over a much broader landscape, and it's on a much broader group of soils throughout our country. So it's not just the traditionally summer safe or the traditionally high fertile landscapes. So chicory has fitted in those landscapes because of its drought tolerance and true extensive dry. When I say, and low rainfall, when I'm talking about that, like 500 mil rainfalls right through to 750 to 800 mil rainfalls is a really happy place for chicory. Remember, my quote was for the dairy industry, is that most of those landscapes that dryland dairy has gone to can be summer dry, but their annual rainfalls are regularly over 1,000 mil in total. So you can see the sheep and beef industry has a footprint over the same rainfall zones, but it also extends way into quite a broad types of soils and rainfall zones that actually chicory has quite a strong place, basically, in just general pasture.
So apart from putting it in with our general pasture mixes, specifically if we were looking for situations where we've got higher proportions of chicory, maybe that's with a rare clover or other clovers as we're using almost in a cropping phase, how would we use that in those farming systems?
Well, the key really is once you start systemizing and working out in your farming program, what are the multipliers as far as what you can, really impact your income? And if you are looking at the world of high health finishing or finishing off the mother once the animal is weaned, the young animal is weaned, you tend to find the history of the live weight gain, the animal performance, the micronutrient cycling. All of that history has been done on summer live weight gain work throughout the history of domesticating chicory in New Zealand forage system. So plenty of literature about summer live weight gain. So you tend to find it's used the most in the summer live weight gain on finishing animals. systems. But because it's sheep and beef, and because our average rainfalls are quite a lot lower in the majority of those systems, we are also looking for perenniality. And when I say perenniality, it's not lasting 10 years. We are talking about lasting more than 1 year. And so we're going through at least one winter and at least 2 summers. We are seeing, depending on your landscape, it's very, very hard to get chicory through a second winter and into a third summer. The species does not have a lot of wriggle room with true perenniality. It can seed, but if it does seed, you've left it to get to a really quite a messy state with these wooden seed heads still being there by the time the seed is viable. So it can get quite messy if you try to get natural reseeding.
Yeah, and I think you've highlighted the use of chicory as a crop, with or without clover, and other species is really driving for that a finishing system where we're trying to finish cattle, we're trying to finish our lambs. We've got weaner deer on that, and we're trying to finish those. So it lends itself to this increased animal performance. And I guess the if you want to strip that back a little bit and go, well, what does that do that ryegrass, for example, doesn't do? I think that there's a couple of really critical bits
the
here.
Questions I'd ask you, like tell me about the nutritional profile and, like everything from the way animals are grazing it to how it breaks down to, literally the micronutrient traits of chicory.
I'm glad you asked. So I think it's one of those plants that lends itself to be easily harvested and for a high intake. And when you think about grass, and I think we've said this on other podcasts, but if you think about grass, perennial ryegrass, for example, is one of the more difficult things to graze, particularly at lower covers. And that's because we've got very fine leaves. A lot of the dry matter of the whole plant is in the base.
Glenn, so just quickly, how many bites in a day to get a diet for a sheep out of a grass pasture?
Oh, listen, we're into the 20,000 bites.
But average about 12?
Yeah, we can. If we make it really hard, we can. I think the upper limit is just a shade under 30,000 bites for a day. These grass pastures, we can make them incredibly hard because we're pushing them into fine leaves where most of the dry matter is at the base. You see things like chicories and plantains and brassicas, even clovers, the way they're structured, they lend themselves for those animals to harvest far more in every bite. And therefore what we get is a much higher intake when we make it easy. Chicory, as you've already suggested, is a leaf which is a full leaf, much larger than a ryegrass tiller, if you like, and therefore in 1 or 2 bites, the amount of dry matter going down a sheep's throat or cattle or deer is so much larger, and so they are able to graze more in a day relative to a ryegrass,
faster,
and much faster. So that's the ease of harvest thing. The other thing that these, particularly dicots and plantain, is actually another really good example. Clover also is because the way those plants are actually put together, if you like. When they get into the animal's stomach, the breakdown speed into the particle size which is allowed to exit the rumen is so much faster. So I'll just give you some kind of some general metrics around that. If you're a perennial ryegrass, it's going to take about 6 hours for half of what you eat to break down in the rumen to then pass out of that.
So it gets to a small enough particle size in the rumen to actually move.
For a sheep, it's got to get to a particle size which is a bit like the kitchen sieve. So if your material hasn't broken down to that size, you're going to still be in there, and likely the animal will regurgitate you and re-chew it. So if you think about that, so that breakdown speed is actually quite slow for ryegrass. For things like chicory, that speed is incredibly quick. 2.5 hours means half of the stuff that you've just eaten is down to that particle side and has moved out of the rumen. And what that means is animals will return to grazing so much sooner. There's some really good work out of Massey University on deer actually that show that the amount of time animals spent ruminating, that's regurgitating what they've already chewed and re-chewing, is so much less in chicory crops, because by the time they sit down and go, I might regurgitate a bit to re-chew, it's actually gone. So ruminating times are so much less, and animals return to grazing so much sooner. And so a large chunk of why animals do very, very well on these crops is they actually eat more. in the day. Because of that processing speed is much faster. So that's a really important point. The other thing is with these herbs, they tend to have low structural fibre. That is true until they go to seed, and therefore digestibility of that material, the stuff that is not going to make it all the way through the animal and come out in fecal material, is a little higher. So on all of those fronts, we get increased intake. It's processed faster, and the animal gets to use more of it. Means that we get these higher rates of animal performance. When we put those in.
That description I gave you regarding the dairy usage is that, like just before milking in a hot day, it's very hard to stimulate more intake under those weather conditions. So fits perfectly.
I think the other thing that chicory does bring is we do know it has a high ash content, which means that it does accumulate things like copper and selenium, B12, those types of things. So again, it's a much better bridge of passing trace elements that might be in your soil onto the animal. And I think that's also, we don't always get live weight gain responses to supplementing with trace elements, but where we are deficient and we are using multiple strategies of improving the trace element status of growing animals, for example, using that in fertilizer and using the herbs as a bridge between the two is certainly part of a trace element.
If I was thinking in parts per million and comparing to pasture under an equivalent soil environment, I think it's about 60 to 70% carries something like copper at 60 to 70% that of what the grass species in the same landscape would be.
Yeah, certainly grass is not great at passing on, probably not as bad as brassicas, but certainly not nearly as good as the herbs. The plantains and the chicories are much better bridge for passing those over.
And I do sometimes think, it's not to be too confused with the soil, the rooting depth. This rooting depth can be a bit of a distraction about the true microbial interaction or the soil interface. I think with the soil depth, that the taproot of chicory is one of the big roots you can put into the ground. Lucerne is another. Maybe a radish, for example. They punch big roots into the ground. I think there's definitely an element of soil moisture harvesting associated with chicory, but I still believe the majority of the magic occurs in quite a shallow profile when it comes to chicory. It's just got better relationships with the top 20 centimetres as far as bringing micronutrients in. Yeah. The depth of the root is more about moisture.
Yeah, and
which will bring out the nutrients, but there's less down there.
Yeah, and I, just because I've got access to a larger pool of soil, I agree with you. I think the magic happens in the top where it's able to take up more of those more efficiently, differently, and that relationship with the soil biota, I think is clearly better. So the other couple of things that chicory brings to a system, not only from a performance point of view, but related to that is we certainly know from a internal parasite perspective that having chicory in your sward or having chicory crops means it's much more difficult for infective larvae, L3 larvae from our major internal parasites, for those larvae to get in the zone to be consumed. And so they don't hold water nearly the same. Larvae do not like climbing up and down these things, and therefore the challenge to animals grazing is so much less.
So what you're saying is that the larvae can be deposited within the stem, but it's how the structure of the chicory plant isn't necessarily as inducive of the larvae getting into the grazing zone.
The two plants that larvae just love to climb up and hang on, one of them is perennial ryegrass, the other is brown top, and they hold moisture. The hatching rates of those eggs are much higher, and therefore the challenge to the animal is much higher. We can certainly break some of that cycle down by having herbs like chicory and plantain in the sward, and for no other reason necessarily apart from the fact that they're architecture means that those infective larvae are not nearly as high a concentration in the grazing zone. So that's really useful. The other thing that that we're just starting to understand is that some of the polyunsaturated fatty acids that are in the plant and the speed at which they move through rumen does actually provide some benefit to the animal in terms of they can certainly utilize those. And there are some programs that are already commercial where, we've got meat, for example, that is being produced off largely chicory diets. And that meat has quite a different characteristic in terms of having more polyunsaturated fatty acids in the meat, and the way that cooks and the consumer acceptance is different to some of the other meats.
Yeah, that's been an awesome journey, and that particular system is actually really worthy of a future podcast, actually. And I think that's something we will have on our cards for 2024, actually, is to dive a bit deeper into the history of what's going on in that space.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and fascinating journey. It's one of those ones where we weren't quite looking at that. We were looking for some other things and discovered that there was some very powerful effects going on in things like chicory. So the other kind of the reasons that you would use chicory outside of dairy, very much focused on animal performance, on reducing fecal egg counts or the challenge to animals grazing those, and some changes in meat, and we can describe those a little later. I guess the next question really is around in terms of grazing management, and let's just come out of dairy and focus on our sheep and beef and deer systems where we're using that for finishing. You've mentioned that at our first grazing we need to get to that 6 or 7 true leaf before we get into that. 7, right? Yeah. Quite specific in that.
Well, it's more 7 to 8.
Right.
So it's not 6 to 7, it's 7 to 8.
So we are wanting this crop to actually move on quite a bit before we
absolutely,
get
because
into
different animals
grazing.
are more capable of ripping things out of the ground, and sheep can be quite aggressive as well in that space.
Yep. So then what would you be comfortable in terms of a grazing rotation length? Probably at a very high level, are we wanting them longer or shorter? And then kind of give us a feel for in a New Zealand system what that would look like.
Well, the New Zealand systems are always sort of divvied up between first year crops and second and third year crops. I do think they're quite distinctly different. So we've described the dairy system already, but the sheep and beef and deer system relates to it, and the opportunity that comes from it should be seen as the same. A timely establishment in the spring is really attractive. You can establish a crop in the autumn. However, you got to remember one thing is that once you go through a winter, all your plants are vernalized, and therefore their very next growth phase is to go reproductive. By sowing in the spring, you get the whole summer and the following autumn of predominantly leaf production because they haven't gone through a winter. So therefore, a young chicory stand is without doubt its own recipe for the first season, and it's got a huge number of advantages because it's young, it's healthy, it can be relatively intensely managed, and it pretty much forms the same criteria as we discussed for the dairy earlier. You're starting at 7 to 8 true leaves. You're looking at a start of 18 to 22, 24 centimetres, again, 2,400 Ks in the first round. Then you're probably, due to the landscapes you're in, because you might not be in the growthiest environments like some of the dairy landscapes, you're probably looking at more like a 25 to 28 day rotation, looking at 2,800 to 3,000 kilograms of dry matter on offer. But you are starting to consider grazing down and watching your grazing residual a little bit more carefully, targeting that sort of 5 centimetres. I think it's about the middle knuckle on your middle finger is a really nice general visual for identifying how much residual to leave behind, because with sheep, it's so easy to graze to very, very low residuals. Now, the key is the longer you do that for, the more you start to damage the crowns of these plants and start to lose more plants. So the biggest mission in the sheep and beef systems is to maintain population density for as long as possible and not challenge it. So one of the first challenges is getting through your first season is relatively straightforward because it's the glory phase. There's no reseeding. The crowns of these plants are quite low into the ground, so there's an element of resilience. There you're just trying to maximize your growth. But as you take these crops into their first winter, you do have to be quite careful because any growth, excessive growth you've got in the cool season, the ability to graze in winter without damaging your valuable second year crop is quite a big deal. So technically you'd graze in periods where the soil is not really saturated. You tend to graze with lighter stock classes. You tend to try and get across these areas with relatively small covers on them as fast as you can and minimize damage in the wet or cool season. And then as you hit early spring, particularly the first and second month of spring, you are looking to slowly build up your stocking pressure on it. So again, having a stock class that you can keep elevating the pressure is really attractive because by about the first or second week of the middle of spring, you are going to see reproductive development, and it's at this time you want to be right on top of it. So Glenn, earlier you mentioned the development of these tall, long stems and how hollow they are. Well, this is exactly right. As they develop, they become more and more tubular, more hollow in the middle. And as you take the tops off that, you leave this stick with a hollow tube basically right to the top of the taproot. And if you get natural rainfall that fills that up, you have water sitting on top of the taproot. And that's a really good system for actually seeing a rotting of the top of the plant. The other thing is as those stems lignify and become more like wood, every time a cattle beast or an animal breaks it, that's a damage event to the top of the chicory plant. And again, if you're in a humid environment where the soil is wet, naturally secondary plant diseases can kick in. You got a damage event, you get a secondary plant soft rot come in, for example, sclerotinia comes in and it'll just rot out that whole system. With chicory, some of those plants can actually hold on for about a month to 2 months after they've been damaged. They are plants that are going to die. Some of them look like they've had phenoxychemical damage. They get contorted and twisted leaves, but what's actually happening is they've got a root disease that's impacting the vascular system and they're just taking 2 to 3 months to die. So if you've had wet winter grazings, you don't normally see the plant collapse until the second half of spring or the start of summer. And then suddenly your sward will, or your crop will be quite a lot more open. So wet winter grazing is actually a big deal in the second season, and stem and seed head management.
The other challenge that I see, and we see this a lot as we've elevated the amount going through into finishing lambs, is certainly, again, in those wet environments, this plant can actually be quite low in dry matter.
Yeah, correct.
So when we've got animals grazing through this, it's not unheard of to see dry matters below 10%.
Oh,
in fact,
8% would be quite common.
And so what that means is at that point, animals physically can't harvest. We've talked about those harvest dynamics as an easy plant to eat, but they've got to eat so much in fresh weight just to get.
Well, they're eating close to 92% water, aren't they?
Exactly. And so that can be quite problematic where you've got animals that are really wanting to grow, but the intake of dry matter, of energy, is being hampered by the fact that it's very, very wet feed and they're dealing with a huge amount of water which they haven't to excrete.
I always get to this point. It's not my sphere, it's your sphere, but I get to this point because I deal with it as well in the sense that our plants are meeting people's expectations. But one thing I've always seen with these periods of low live weight gain, it's actually multiple factors that are kicking in here, and obviously dry matter you've highlighted, but nearly always this is associated with long periods of overcast weather. You've had potentially rainfall events, but you've had long periods of overcast weather. So you tend to get 3 things impacting all at once. One, you've got getting higher and higher dry matter percentages, lower and lower, but higher and higher water content. Yep. Soon as you do have these very, very low dry matter percentages, you've got low natural structural fibre. Yep. So you've got high water, low fibre, and because you don't have sunshine, you tend to find you're still absorbing nitrogen, but you're not necessarily converting it to extra growth because the sun's not driving it. So you've actually got elevating crude proteins too. So you've got this sort of trifecta of things that are impacting animal performance, as well as the animal itself's not getting a lot of sunshine. So you got these three big mechanisms, lots and lots of water, very, very little fiber, and actually elevating protein levels.
Yeah, and I think that's the other point, is the other challenge is that this plant is or can be quite problematic from a nitrate poisoning point of view, particularly under the situations that you describe. And one of the things that we have played around with is in these situations, can mowing and wilting prior to grazing be a solution to this? And what we've largely found is the answer is no. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it would appear that if you could wilt and get the water out of this, that you would solve some of those problems. But typically, from a practical point of view, you're trying to do that in an environment where you've just described as wet, overcast. And actually, there's not a lot of evaporation happening at that point. So what you end up doing is you end up cutting this, and it ends up rotting rather than wilting. And so we haven't really found a good way of doing this. What you've actually got to do is hurry up and wait for the sun to come out.
Exactly. And as you described, the whole concept of wilting, if you're in an environment that can create a wilt, you probably don't have the problem.
No, that's right. So just have a talk a little bit about the types of chicory. Maybe mention a couple of the Agricom cultivars, but there are a couple of different types, and you might like to just flesh that out.
Oh, look, we work with a variety called Choice, which is one of the largest chicories in New Zealand. And the key is that second generation from the variety I mentioned at the start, which is Puna. So, I'm very, very proud to be part of a seed business that has had a strong heritage to the development of both of the herbaceous species that are used in general pasture in the world, actually being chicory and plantain. We literally have helped develop these in world agriculture. So it's a pretty cool place to be. But Choice is very much a significant chicory in the New Zealand landscape. And as I described to you, it's the second generation out of the Puna original chicory source. So what we're looking at it as a plant like that is a very, very natural biennial. If you go into some quite semi-arid parts of our country with good free draining soil, this plant can survive for many years in those conditions. But like I say, it gets more and more difficult to see true perenniality in high rainfall environments with big animals grazing on wet soils. So we have got resilience and we have got persistence tied up in this variety, but it's not as its defining feature. There's also a group of styles that are not quite as perennial in trait, but as I say, we're talking about a dairy system that is a more defined window of time. But if you took one of those and tried to get it to last 2 to 3 years, they would have a much bigger collapse phase in the second spring. So there's quite two distinct styles that are set out there as we see at the moment. You tend to find that style is a little bit more autumn active as well and a little bit more winter active, which is actually conflicting as well, because the last thing you want is too much winter activity, because then you're forced to make a decision on, do I use it in wet conditions? So that's another scenario. But Choice is it's a pretty good choice for most people, I would suggest.
I see what you did there, El. Hey, summary. Can you give me a minute summary on chicory, the plant, how it's used, and the key attributes?
Oh well, chicory is such an important species that has been commercialised in New Zealand in our really unique landscape, which is this temperate grazing environment. It has always been in the system, and the things that we've valued most about it. It is this extremely highly nutritious herbal species that just fits so well into summer production systems. It's got a taproot that gives it the opportunity to hold on in the dry and really produce over time. Where the biggest systemization of it has occurred is as a key protein source in the dairy sector and summer dry dairy environments. There are summer dry environments that have become less and less reliable as summers have got longer and longer. And chicory is an absolute winner when it comes to the length of dry you may be facing. So if it's only 5 weeks, turnips are very, very functional in that space. But at 5 weeks, turnips are very, very nearly finished on farm. You cannot actually take them that much longer successfully. And chicory can just get better and better through the second half of summer and into autumn. So it's a really strategic and flexible summer feed for an environment where you are looking for that really highly nutritious protein and elevated intake in those summer months. I think the key message from a getting it going perspective, do your feed budgets, identify how much you need. You don't necessarily want to put any more than you need. It's very important because it doesn't necessarily grow all year round, which means you don't want to overcommit to it. So you just want to get what you need to achieve your primary tasks. The most important point of being efficient is to get it established in the ideal window. With all due respect to the stresses people face in spring between mating, being concerned about not having a surplus, all these things, nothing is actually more important at that moment than getting your timing right for establishment, because if you go too late, you may be going into droughted conditions and have actual failures, which are vastly more costly to your farm business than giving up 2 weeks of grass in the middle of spring. So timeliness is one of the most important secrets to getting summer cropping, but particularly chicory cropping going. Get it in the right time. This will give you your best window for establishment and your best speed to first grazing. And the sooner you get to your first grazing, the sooner you can get your regrowths in. And the more regrowth cycles you get defines how much you produce in your given time frame. So sowing conditions and sowing time frame, 12 degrees and rising, right in the middle of that sweet spot for establishment, not too close to the dry, and to get your first grazing as soon as possible into the summer months. They would probably be my big take-homes. With dairy, it makes up 20% of the diet through the summer months, with most of the lamb finishing and cattle finishing. Anywhere over 80% of the diet can be achieved. I think they would be the biggies. I'd do one, it's not a downer, but it's just a self-awareness. There are very few chemical options as far as weed control. In some environments, you might have to do a little pre-work to deserve the right to utilise chicory in its full glory, and that might be using annual ryegrass or Italian ryegrass as a lead-in crop so you can control thistles before you bring chicory into your landscape. It's pretty depressing when you put chicory in your landscape and you get a wall-to-wall thistle environment because there is no chemicals that you can use to take those weeds out of chicory. It is the same species as many of those weeds. So there are chemicals, but they're all early establishment and quite weak in the range that they target. So be aware of your history and your properties. I feel that probably sums it up really nicely, but it's a highly nutritious plant, ideal for summer cropping, ideal for creating diversity in pastures. It does not live forever, but when it's there, it really delivers at a very high level.
Oh, well, we'll leave it there, Al. I've actually got to go and see my mum. Do you know what? Someone stole all the grass from around her house. She wasn't very happy. So when I got there, she was just looking forlorn.
I think on that one, we must finish.
See ya.
Or we'll be chased off.
See you, Al.
Thanks, Juddy. Bye.